So this video is about heat exchangers. It's kind of a boring topic, but once your base gets on its feet and you start going somewhere and you're getting to the mid-game, being able to understand what a heat exchanger is and build one when you need one and recognize when you need one will make or break the game. If you want to develop your base into something big and amazing, you definitely want to learn about heat exchangers. And this video is all about this. Like I said, it's not the most exciting subject to me, and you'll be able to hear it in my voice. It's kind of I'm a pretty droll in this one, unfortunately, but it's worth your time if you want to take this game seriously. A heat exchanger is a device that lets you take the heat from one element and put it into another element really efficiently. This simple one that I've created is the one I'll show you first. I think this is a good choice to show you first because it lets me demonstrate the principle. Very cold petroleum at negative 35 degrees over here, and some hot hydrogen at looks like it's about 540 degrees over here. I will send the petroleum into one end of the heat exchanger this direction from this side, and the hydrogen in the other end of the heat exchanger from this side. Let's focus on the petroleum first. What will happen is the petroleum, as it moves through this pipe, it will get to this metal tile, and it will give up some of its coldness to the metal tile, and that will warm up the petroleum a bit. In the next metal tile, it will give up more of its coldness, and that will also warm up the petroleum a bit. This metal tile won't get as cold because the petroleum has already warmed up a bit by going through this metal tile. This will continue all the way through the heat exchanger. If that's all we did, eventually all of these tiles would get very cold and not much would happen. We do the same thing with the hydrogen entering from the other side, and the same effect happens, where the first metal tile is especially hot and the next one is a bit colder and the next one is a bit colder. So the combination of the cold stuff going in one side and the hot stuff going in the other makes a gradient of temperature across these tiles, where this tile is cold and this one is hot, and all of the tiles in between them change in temperature a little bit. So that the petroleum comes out this side hot and the hydrogen comes out that side cold. We should be able to get the petroleum very close to the temperature of the hydrogen, and we should be able to get the hydrogen cooled down to very close to the temperature of the petroleum. Intuitively, it's easy to assume that the best change in temperature would be the same as if you were to mix these materials together and get their average temperature. But with a heat exchanger, you can do much better than that. Theoretically, a 100% efficient heat exchanger can completely change those temperatures so that the petroleum gets all the way up to about 540 and the hydrogen gets all the way down to negative 35. In practice, you can't have a 100% heat exchanger, but if you were to make it big enough and efficient enough, then you could get very close. I'm going to turn this on. Alright, so now we have petroleum going through this side. I have a valve here. That will matter in a minute. I'll show you what that's for. And there's hydrogen going in this side. Let's have a look at the temperatures. As you can see, the first tiles are getting cold from the petroleum. And these tiles over here, they were already hot from my experiments earlier, but this last tile will probably stay hot, and the rest of them will get quite cold. The reason this is happening is because there's 10 kilograms per second of petroleum going in this side of the heat exchanger, and only 1 kilogram per second of hydrogen going in this side of the heat exchanger. The cold of the petroleum is overpowering the heat in the hydrogen. There's no way to carry so much heat in this amount of hydrogen to warm up the petroleum all the way. So the hydrogen is coming out of the heat exchanger in this pipe up here, and when I hover over it, you can see that it is indeed all the way down to negative 35 degrees, the temperature of the petroleum. On this side of the heat exchanger, you can see the petroleum coming out, and it's only at 43 degrees, which is nowhere close to the 540 degrees of the hydrogen that is going into the heat exchanger on this side. Sometimes this imbalance is what you want because you just want to, say, in this case, cool down the hydrogen, and the ultimate temperature of the petroleum doesn't matter to you. This has some problems that you may run into depending what you're doing. for example, I'm using much more petroleum in the heat exchanger than necessary in order to cool down the hydrogen. The way to fix this problem is to balance the amount of hydrogen going into the heat exchanger with the amount of petroleum going into the heat exchanger. But you don't want to do it by mass. There is a property called specific heat capacity. For hydrogen, as you can see, it is 2.4. 2.4 is the amount of energy it takes to change the temperature of an amount of hydrogen 1 degree Celsius. And if we look at the petroleum, it also has a specific heat capacity. It is 1.76. Because that number is lower than the specific heat for hydrogen, it means that it takes less energy to change the temperature of the petroleum than it does to change the temperature of the hydrogen. So, in order to balance this, we will need more petroleum in the heat exchanger than hydrogen, but certainly less than what we're doing now. The way to calculate the right amount is to just divide those numbers. The specific heat of the hydrogen is 2.4, divided by the specific heat of the petroleum is 1.76. We get, well, 1.364. That means for every 1 kilogram of hydrogen going into the heat exchanger, we need 1.364 kilograms of petroleum going into the heat exchanger, and then their specific heats will be balanced. I will use him to set the valve to let 1.364 kilograms of petroleum through. Now our heat exchanger should be balanced, and we should get a good exchange of heat between the petroleum and the hydrogen that is much more efficient, much more balanced, let's say, than what we were doing before. If you look at the temperature, you'll see that the temperatures in the heat exchanger, they're starting to, this side's starting to get hot, as it should. I'm going to speed up this process by turning off the petroleum temporarily. For this example, it will be normal for most of the tiles to look red, and that's just because red is the color of anything that's hot, and we're using mostly hot temperatures. Reconnect the petroleum input, and we can wait just long enough for it to find a nice equilibrium, and then we can have a look at the temperature. So the petroleum is going in at negative 35 degrees, and if I hover over this, you can see that it's coming out at 485 degrees. That's still not as hot as the hydrogen that is going into the heat exchanger. The fact that it's not getting all the way up to 540 degrees like the hydrogen going into the heat exchange is something that I would call inefficiency. The hydrogen coming out of the heat exchange, I'll hover over this so you can see, is at 18.3 degrees Celsius. That's not as cold as the petroleum. This particular heat exchange is pretty naive, so you wouldn't expect it to be extremely good. I'm going to turn that off and show you a better way to set up a heat exchanger that works like this one with metal tiles. A better way to lay out a heat exchanger, a metal tile heat exchanger that works like that, is in a checkerboard pattern with insulation between the tiles. By the way, the reason to put insulation between the tiles is to prevent the heat from one metal tile from moving to adjacent metal tiles. So you don't really want them touching each other. And it turns out making the heat exchanger much more efficient if you do it that way. You'll see for this layout the pipe for the petroleum serpentines through all of the tiles, and the pipe for the hydrogen serpentines through the tiles going the other direction. This counterflow is of course very important to the heat exchange, in case that wasn't obvious. Connect the power to this one and turn it on. The petroleum is coming through the valve so that it's balanced with the hydrogen. This heat exchange has 18 metal tiles, and the one I showed you before has 10 metal tiles, so we should get much better efficiency from this one. The hydrogen is all the way down to negative 16 degrees from 540, and the petroleum is up all the way to 492 from negative 35 degrees. So I think that's quite good. If you want it to be better efficiency using this kind of heat exchange, you can just make the heat exchange bigger with more metal tiles. A heat exchanger like this one has some good advantages and some serious limitations. I think the main limitation is that it's low volume. You can only exchange heat with as much stuff as you can put through a pipe. And if you try to make it, you can use more than one pipe, but you have to make the heat exchange sort of bigger and unusual looking, and you lose some efficiency very quickly. One thing I'd like to mention is there is a third medium that heat has to travel through in order to move from the petroleum to the hydrogen, and that is the metal tile. With many heat exchangers, using that third medium makes them often untenable, and so it's something to avoid when you're designing heat exchangers. Another problem is that because you're using pipes, it's fairly straightforward to do a liquid and a gas, but it becomes much more complicated to do a liquid to a liquid or a gas to a gas. This heat exchanger isn't great for that either. Another main problem is that if you have a change of state inside the pipe, it will break the pipe. So if you're trying to cook oil into petroleum, for example, when the oil turns into petroleum, it will break the pipe. And so a heat exchanger like this may not be a good choice for that. Now I'd like to show you an entire setup for cooking oil into petroleum. If you've ever tried to cook oil into petroleum without a heat exchange, then this will be a really good demonstration of how awesome a heat exchanger is. Also, it will demonstrate using stairs as a heat exchange. Also, it will show a practical use. I have crude oil in here. It's pretty cold. Yeah, it's very cold, -35 degrees. It goes through a shutoff, a liquid shutoff, which we'll talk about in a minute, and drops the oil on the top step of this stairway. You'll notice that this is already quite hot from my experience earlier, but that shouldn't matter for the demonstration. The oil runs down the stairs into this bottom area where the aqua tuner heats up the oil to the temperature that cooks it into petroleum. When this has enough liquid on it to trigger this hydrosensor, then that hydrosensor will turn off the shutoff that lets oil into the heat exchange. That's important because before it's warmed up enough to start going, we don't want to overload it with liquid. This thermosensor turns off the aqua tuner when the petroleum down here is hot enough to maintain its temperature. And this thermosensor turns on the liquid pump when the petroleum at the bottom is hot enough. We don't want the pump to begin pumping oil back up through the heat exchanger. We only want it to pump petroleum through the heat exchanger. Petroleum goes up through this radiant pipe, warming up the oil that's moving down the stairs so that it can be turned into petroleum. That's the heat exchange part. And then it exits the heat exchange through this pipe. You'll see I have a room of supercoolant over here. The only reason that's there is so that the aqua tuner has something to cool. In your base, you'll have to find some other use for the coldness that comes from the aqua tuner. We can see the oil is moving through the pipe, falling onto the top stair, and going down the stairs. When the oil gets to the bottom, the aqua tuner turns on and warms it up. The first time you turn your heat exchanger on, it will have to run to get it warmed up for the first time. You'll notice that the hydrosensor has turned off the shutoff so that the oil doesn't continue going into the heat exchanger and just pooling at the bottom faster than it can be warmed up. The oil got hot enough to change into petroleum, which triggered this thermosensor and turned on the liquid pump. And that hot petroleum is being pumped up the stairs, warming up the oil on the way, and exiting the heat exchange, as you can see. Since we're moving liquid out of this area, the hydrosensor detected that there wasn't enough liquid and turned on the supply of oil. Now we should find a nice equilibrium where the oil is running down the stairs, being warmed up by the petroleum, and continuously changed and cooked into petroleum. You'll notice that the aqua tuner doesn't even turn on all the time. I think it runs about half the time. And this ought to convert 10 kilograms of oil into 10 kilograms petroleum continuously per second. The steps are important. The oil that's sitting on top of this step doesn't transmit heat to the oil sitting on top of this step. So we get isolated squares that don't transfer heat between each other, much like the isolated tiles in this heat exchange up here don't transfer heat between each other. That's important for the heat exchange. Otherwise, it becomes very inefficient and the heat exchange would have to be very large in order to work. You'll notice that the oil is going into the heat exchange at -35 degrees and the petroleum is coming out of the heat exchange at 15 degrees. Oh, that's a bit better than I expected. Still, that's a 50-degree difference in temperature. The reason that's happening is that this is not a balanced heat exchange. The specific heat in this heat exchange is not balanced. because the specific heat of the oil is less than the specific heat of the petroleum. It can't be balanced because the output from the heat exchange is connected to the input of the heat exchange. They both have to be 10 kilograms. So you will always have petroleum that is hotter than the oil that's going in. This kind of heat exchange has some major benefits. One of them is that it can handle a change of state. Clearly the oil is changing into petroleum, and because it's not happening inside of a pipe, it doesn't break anything. You'll also notice that there isn't an intermediate medium. The petroleum and the oil are exchanging heat with each other very directly. That's in contrast to the previous kind of heat exchange, which uses a metal tile as an intermediate medium. Usually, this means that the heat exchange will be much more efficient. I see that sometimes the oil is getting turned off, and I suspect that it's just a temporary thing that will work itself out when this reaches an equilibrium. This heat exchanger cooks oil into sour gas. You will see this kind of setup very frequently in natural gas cookers. Cold oil at negative 35 degrees. It will be pumped into these valves, which emit 1 kilogram per second each. So these radiant pipes will carry 1 kilogram per second through this chamber up to the top, where they come out of these vents and change into sour gas. The heat that does that, the source of the heat, comes from this aqua tuner in a small room full of steam. This thermosensor turns off the aqua tuner when the steam gets very hot, in this case 800 degrees. These doors are only here to destroy the sour gas that's created, because I'm not doing anything with it in this demo. The reason I only put 1 kilogram per second through these pipes is because 1 kilogram per second or less in a pipe doesn't change state in the pipe. That means oil in this pipe can be heated up to any temperature and it won't turn into petroleum or sour gas. When it comes out of the vent, then it will change into sour gas because it's already hot enough in order for that state change to happen. You can see the oil is traveling up the radiant pipes to the vents. Right now it's not hot because the chamber the oil is moving through is empty. There's nothing there to warm it up yet. As it comes out of the vent, it's absorbing heat from the steam in this room through these metal tiles and turning into sour gas. We can start to see the sour gas. That sour gas will move through the chamber and create a counterflow with the oil that's moving up through the chamber. The sour gas has reached all the way to the bottom of the chamber and is being destroyed by my door destroyers. You'll notice that the aqua tuner doesn't run very often in order to keep this room at 800 degrees. And I've determined that it's possible to convert 10 kilograms per second of oil using 10 pipes using only one aqua tuner. There are other setups for the hot end of this kind of heat exchange that use a door to draw out only as much heat as necessary from the hot room. I didn't use it for this demo. One thing to remember about doing heat exchange with gases is that there is some phenomena in oxygen not included that is related to hot gases rising. I'm not too sure about all of the dynamics, but it's definitely a real thing. So orient your chamber so that the hot end is at the top if it's full of gases, and that way you can take advantage of that. There's another important phenomenon in play with this kind of heat exchanger that's important for you to know. Intuitively, it seems like you could make this heat exchanger as efficient as you like just by making the chamber longer. It turns out it doesn't work that way. As you make the chamber longer, more pressure builds at the top because it has to push all of the gases all the way down to the bottom. And all of that mass has to be made hot in order for the heat exchanger to stay hot at the top. That makes the heat exchange much less responsive. In other words, it takes a long time for it to warm up. At the extreme, it can take hundreds of cycles in order to warm up and really get started where your heat exchanger is working. Another thing that happens when you have those high pressures is that the volatility of the temperature in a tile decreases. What I mean is, if there were 100 kilograms of sour gas in this tile, then its temperature changes very little when one bubble of oil goes through it. That loss of volatile temperatures makes it a lot harder for the heat exchanger to do its job. The combination of those two things appears to put a hard limit on how long you can make a heat exchanger that works like this one. The longer you make it, the less you gain in efficiency each time you make it longer. You can get around much of that by making it wider because the pressure it doesn't have to build up as much pressure to push gases through a wide chamber than it does through a narrow chamber. So in practice, when you make large complicated devices using a heat exchange like this, you also have to figure out how to keep this chamber short. That seems to be true even with very wide chambers. Like in some of my experience, I use one that is 10 tiles wide. That said, this is an extremely efficient heat exchange. You can get the temperature of the oil in the pipe almost to the same temperature as the sour gas outside the pipe before it exits the vent, which means you don't have to put much energy into the aquatuner. You'll also notice that this is an imbalanced heat exchange because the output depends on the input. That means because the specific heat of the sour gas is much higher than the specific heat of the oil, that the sour gas will always come out hot, much hotter than the oil. Right now, the heat exchanger hasn't warmed up all the way, so we're not seeing that effect so much. I will speed it up and maybe we can get a look at it. I let this run for a while and I ate a sandwich, and as you can see, the sour gas is coming out at a bit under, around 50 degrees Celsius, which is about what you should expect, I think. So this heat exchange, very interesting. It has some dynamics that I don't understand. Here's cold crude oil, and we're going to convert it into sour gas, same as the last one. It will dump out, I'll show you the pipes, it will dump out the crude oil out of this vent, and the crude oil will run off each side onto these tiles, and it will run off each side of those tiles onto these tiles, so that it runs back and forth across these tiles all the way down the heat exchange into the bottom, where these aquatuners warm it up and turn it into sour gas. This thermosensor is there to turn the aquatuners off when it gets too hot, and this hydrosensor is there to turn off the oil while there's a pool of liquid down here, so that we don't overload it while it's warming up. There is a room of supercoolant, and that's just there so that the aquatuners have something to make cold. If you do this in your base, you'll have to find something else to do with the coldness. Probably if you're cooking crude oil into sour gas, you'll want to use it to condense the sour gas into methane. The sour gas, once it's created down here, will rise through the heat exchange, warming up the oil until it gets to the top, and I have a row of doors which destroy the sour gas since I'm not doing anything with it in this demo. I'll turn it on so that we can see how it works. Slow this down a little bit. So you can see the oil is running down. Oh, I need to turn on the aquatuners also. Great. So the sour gas will run to the bottom. The oil will run to the bottom and begin pooling. And when there's enough of it, this hydrosensor will turn off the supply of oil so that the heat exchange can get started. I see the sour gas has started to be created, so the oil got turned back on, and it's now dribbling down through the sour gas. Now the heat exchange seems to be running at full capacity. Right now it's set up to do 10 kilograms of oil per second. The interesting thing that I have noticed about this heat exchange, the dynamic that I don't understand, is that you can put as much oil into it as you like. I tried it with 40 kilograms per second and it still worked. You will need to add more aquatuners to produce more heat, but you don't need a bigger heat exchange. Also, I've noticed that you don't have to make it, making it bigger doesn't help. I could make the heat exchange twice as tall as this, and it doesn't really make any difference. From my experiments, it seems that 14 rows of these airflow tiles is about right in order to do the job. One dynamic that seems to be important for the way this heat exchange works is the movement of the liquid going down over the airflow tiles has a pumping effect that moves gases from the bottom to the top. That means it defeats the problem of the previous heat exchange that we were talking about of pressure and volatility. It doesn't seem to be as efficient. Obviously I have to use two aquatuners to make it work, whereas you could do 10 kilograms per second using only one aquatuner in the previous example if you were to scale it up that large. You'll notice that in addition to these airflow tiles, I put temp shift plates in the heat exchange. You don't want to put them too close to each other because then they will transmit heat between each other, and that will change the dynamic of it and move heat to places where you don't want it to go, and it makes it inefficient. So if you somehow manage to get more than 10 kilograms per second of oil in your asteroid, then you could use this heat exchanger to process all of it into sour gas. Unfortunately, that would be very hard to do. 10 kilograms of oil seems to be about the limit consistently in an asteroid, unless perhaps you harvest carbon dioxide from meteors in large quantities, which itself is a pretty massive undertaking. If you look around on the forums, you'll find that there has been a lot of discussion about heat exchangers, and there are a lot of smart people out there who probably have some other designs. So that's definitely worth doing. The main reason I made this video was so that I could make the next video demonstrating a self-powered natural gas cooker. So keep your eyes peeled for that. It shouldn't be long.